Buenos días a todos, buenas tardes, buenas noches, depende de donde se
Good
encuentren.
morning,
Un lujo
good
nuevamente
afternoon,
contar
good
con todos
evening,
ustedes hoy,
wherever you may be.
en esta segunda
It is nice
jornada,
having
en nuestro
you
segundo
here with us
congreso de la
in
red
this
de
second
análisis
day
y buenas
of the
prácticas
second
en PPP.
Congress of
Para
the
nosotros es un
Network
gusto
of
poder contar
Analysis
con
and
todos
Good
ustedes
Practices
y
in
poder
PPP.
estar abordando
We
hoy
are lucky
temas
enough to have you
que
all here
tienen tanta
and to
necesidad en la
address
actualidad para la
some
región, en el contexto de los APPs
topics,
y en un sentido
current
más amplio en
topics
el
that we
contexto
need
del
to
desarrollo de la
address
infraestructura de la región en su
in
conjunto,
PPP and
como
also
son
in the
aquellos
development
relacionados a
of
cuestiones de
infrastructure in
competencia y
the region as a
transparencia,
whole.
como estaremos viendo en el
Also
primer
having
panel
to
que
do
sigue
with
ahora a
competition,
continuación,
transparency,
entendiendo los
as we will
principales
see in the first
problemas de
panel.
competencia asociados al
We will
desarrollo de
understand the
infraestructura
main
en sus modalidades de obra pública
competition
tradicional y de asociaciones
of
público-privadas.
competence
A continuación,
issues regarding infrastructure
tendremos una
and
sesión
public-private
destinada a
partnerships.
abordar todos
Next,
los
we will have
aspectos de la
a
sostenibilidad
session
y la
that will
inclusión
be
de los componentes de
addressing
sostenibilidad desde la preparación de los
sustainability and
proyectos hasta el
inclusion of the
financiamiento de los
sustainability elements
mismos.
from the
Y
preparation
por
of the
último,
projects all the
y
way
antes de
to
la
the financing
clausura,
of
tendremos una
projects.
sesión
And
donde se
finally,
abordarán temas tan
before
necesarios
closing, we will
para la
have a
región,
session where we will be
sobre
addressing
todo entendiendo
important topics
la
for the region,
conflictividad que muchas veces surge en los
particularly
procesos de desarrollo de
understanding
infraestructura,
the conflicts that
conflictividad
sometimes we
social, que
have
pueden
in
ser
the
mitigados a partir
processes
de
of
mecanismos de
development of
participación
infrastructure
ciudadana, inclusividad
and
y
the
género,
social
que se
issues,
tratará en la
citizen
última sesión.
participation,
Estos se estarán
inclusiveness,
uniendo a los temas
gender.
que
This is
tratamos
something we will be
ayer
addressing in the last
y a
session.
las discusiones
These will be
tan
linked to
ricas que
the
pudimos
topics
tener
that we
gracias a la
discussed
presencia
yesterday
de
and
tantos y
also the
tan variados
discussions that
panelistas
we
de la
had
región e
thanks to
internacionales,
the
como han
attendance
sido
of so
modelos
many
de
participants
innovación
from
para
the
el control de
region and
financiamiento de
from abroad,
proyectos, en concreto a través del tercer
innovation models for
operativo, las
financing of
cuestiones de
projects,
infraestructura social y cómo entender de una manera
also
más
in social
comprensiva el análisis
infrastructure and
del
how to
desempeño
better
comparativo de los
understand
proyectos
the
APPs
analysis of
versus obra
comparative
pública tradicional
performance of
y la sesión
projects. This
plenaria
is
que tuvimos la suerte
PPP
de tener ayer en la
versus the
tarde con la
traditional
presentación
projects, and
de la
also
experiencia de infrastructure
last
framework.
evening we
Sin más
also
dilación, le
heard
pasaría la
the
palabra
experience
al
from
especialista
Infrastructure
senior en gestión
Australia.
pública y
Without
transparencia
further
del Banco
ado, I would like to give the
Interamericano de
microphone
Desarrollo, Juan
to
Cruz Vieira, para que
the
introduzca el panel y
specialist
avancemos con la sesión.
Juan Cruz
Muchas gracias a
Vieira
todos y
from
espero que disfrutemos de una gran jornada.
IDB for
Muchas
him
gracias,
to introduce
Ancor.
this session.
Es todo un
Thank you,
placer estar
Ancor.
aquí, compartir con ustedes
It is my
esta
pleasure to be here and to
presentación.
share with all of you this
En primer lugar,
presentation.
bienvenidas y bienvenidos. Soy Juan Cruz Vieira, como les decía,
I would like to
especialista
welcome
senior en
each and every one of
modernización del
you.
Estado.
I
En
am
esta
Juan Cruz
sesión
Vieira. I'm a specialist
llamada Competencia y Transparencia en
in
APP,
the
resolviendo cuellos
modernization
de
of the
botella,
state. Here
contaremos
we
con
will
la
be talking
presentación del
about
estudio Problemas de competencia en procesos de
competition and
desarrollo de
transparency in
infraestructura
PPP.
en
We will be
América Latina y el
addressing
Caribe,
some issues
obra
of
pública
competence
tradicional y
in
asociaciones
the development
público-privadas,
process, infrastructure
elaborado tras el
in
llamado
the
de
Caribbean, Latin
propuestas en el
America,
ciclo
traditional public
2021 de la red
works and
APP.
public-private
Esta
partnerships
presentación estará a cargo de
in
Javier
20th,
Campos, doctor
21st
en
century.
Economía,
This presentation will
profesor de la
be delivered
Universidad de
by
Las Palmas,
Juan Campos,
España, y
Doctor,
experto en
PhD in
regulación y
Economy,
competencia de
Professor at Las
infraestructura.
Palmas in Spain,
Después de esta
experts in
presentación,
regulation and
se seguirá una
competition and
discusión
infrastructure. After
sobre
that
el tema
presentation,
del
we will
panel de
have a panel
invitados, que nos
discussion
compartirán su
about
experiencia en el sector de APPs en América Latina
our
y el
topic, and
Caribe.
the
Al momento de
panelists
las
will be sharing their
presentaciones
experience
de cada
in
uno de ellos,
PPPs in Latin
contaremos
America
un
and the
poco su
Caribbean.
experiencia
During
y
their
luego pasaremos a sus
presentations, we will
presentaciones.
hear about their
Dos
experience, and after
temas
that,
muy
we will
rápidos. La primera
listen
es
to their
la sesión está
presentations.
disponible con interpretación
The session
simultánea
will
en
be
español,
available
inglés y
with
portugués.
simultaneous
Y en segundo
interpretation in
lugar, a lo
English,
largo de las
Spanish, and
presentaciones
Portuguese.
verán un
And
botón de
also,
Q&A, de
during the
preguntas y respuestas.
presentations,
A
you will
quienes
see a
quisieran hacer alguna
Q&A
pregunta, los
button.
invitamos a escribir en
And
este
if you
contexto,
wish to make a
a través
comment
de este
or a
canal,
question,
sus
please
preguntas
write it down
y las trataremos de
on
abordar
this
al
channel. Write
momento de
down
la
your
discusión.
questions in the
Sin
Q&A
más,
box,
paso la
and we will try to
palabra
take
a
your
Javier
questions during the
Campos. Como
discussion.
les mencionaba,
Without
doctor en
further ado, I
Economía,
would
que nos
like
va a
to give the
hacer
floor
la
to
primera
Javier Campos.
presentación
He has a
de
PhD in
aproximadamente unos
economy,
15
and he will be
minutos.
making the first
Javier, el micrófono es tuyo.
presentation. It will be a
Gracias.
15-minute presentation. So Javier will give the microphone over to you. Thank you.
A los organizadores de eso por la invitación.
Thank you to the organizers. Thank you, Juan, for the introduction. As you have said, the purpose of my presentation is to briefly tell you about the main results of our work on the competition issues in the development of infrastructure works. I developed this work with my colleague from Las Palmas University, and our purpose has been to try to identify what those issues are, because the message, as I can tell you up front, is that competency is an issue, a more serious issue than we thought. Why is so? We have heard this yesterday. What was said yesterday is very interesting about the importance that the investment, to have a quantitative investment in PPPs and public works, and the expenditure at the expense that represents. But one reflection that I have is that not only that matters. Sometimes we really focus on trying to have a lot of investment, but we have to be careful, because how the procedure takes place is important, and the why as well. We need to see the purpose. We heard that also, and that's very important. So when we talk about the how and the why, this is to try to see how has this been addressed, because we know that there are certain reports from the World Bank, from the IDB, from multinational organizations. But in order to start this project, first, we carried out a systematic review of the literature for the last 20 years, economic literature, and we tried to make a review to see what the literature of PPP tells us. We went through the literature of public-private procurement. We also read about traditional public works to see the play that the different elements had. Just for, as an example, the words that you see in the map of South America, we have the word infrastructure, private participation, but funnily enough, if competence appears, or competition appears in very little print. So what we are trying to say is that so far there's a gap of knowledge, gap of understanding regarding issues of competition. We have tried to start to address those issues, or to try to narrow that gap. The organic purpose of the... Sorry, Javier, to interrupt. We cannot see your screen. Thank you.
¿Ahora?
No todavía.
Not yet.
¿Y ahora?
Can you see it now?
Ahora sí, ¿no?
Ahora sí.
Perdón.
Can you see it now? Yes, we do. Oh, sorry. I was sharing, but I forgot to push the sharing button. I was just telling you that investment was very heterogeneous. The how much was important, but the how too. We made a review of more than 250 papers from major journals of the academic world, and we've seen that the word competition is not a common word. In fact, in this group of words, you see that competition appears in very little print somewhere there. But competition is important because competition is at the core of the entire infrastructure development process. The role of the state in procurement is to provide services, as we heard yesterday, but provide those services so that those services may contribute to improving well-being of people. So we all know, and here I finished talking about motivation, that the lack of competition leads to higher prices, it leads to a higher public spending, it leads to giving more power to the private sector, inefficient allocations, we have also a problem of corruption and lower social well-being. Usually the infrastructure sectors are sectors that mostly work with little competition. Therefore, it is difficult to have that competition. Therefore, the way to introduce competition here is competition for the market. This is in the process of the design of the contracts. This is how competition needs to be introduced. This is a report from the World Bank. This report is about the competition issues, and here we can see that there are important cartels associated to the non-competition. This is just to have an idea. Spain, for example, 1 billion every year is the loss due to the lack of competition in the delivery processes. In the European Union, lack of competition accounts for 1% of the GDP, of course, according to each country, but in Latin America, the estimates are different. Here we see many dollars, many problems in terms of competition, and that really represents a huge cost when there's lack of competition. So how to face this? One important step is having clear that we need to identify the bottlenecks. There are bottlenecks in the design process for infrastructure projects. We have bottlenecks in the design, implementation, and the result control. And the main issue where our project is focused on, first we try to identify the different phases and competition issues that are associated. Like, for example, we can find 5 stages in the development process of public-private partnerships. We have to define the contract, we have to select the procedure, to design the tenders, to assess proposals, and contract management. This is where we will find issues of competition, and here is where we will need to work with contractual legislation. We will need to work on the administrative processes. We need to set up some reference guides so that we all can use in order to address this issue. This is just an example. First, we need to define the contract. Competition issues sometimes lead to lack of clear scope and content. Oftentimes, we also have competition issues associated to the specific type of contract, because we may choose higher degree of competition or lower degree of competition. Sometimes the public administration is one that provides the service. This is when there's little competition. What are the recommendations from our study? We need to really assess the technical capacity of the management body. We need to assess the costs of internal hiring And also, we need to foster transparency. The second element is to select procedures. Here, we have to detect issues to see whether this is an open or closed procedure. And also, we need to see to what extent information is provided to the different companies that wish to compete for the project. Obviously, in special cases, sometimes we have to resort to extraordinary circumstances, so we need to strike a balance between a closer procedure, but that will lead to better results. So what are the recommendations that we have? We always need to try to explain what are the reasons why we will not be using an open procedure. And once again, to introduce transparency. Regarding the design of the bids or the tenders, which was the third step, here we have come across with these issues. One issue is the access requirements for the tender or for the bid. We need to strike a balance. This is, companies need to comply with the minimum requirements for the bids or for the tenders. We also need to look at the number of users. There could be a risk of moral risk, because a company may win the bid or will take the bid, but they will not be able to perform. And also sometimes we see that there are many technical requirements, economic requirements, and that's good. We need to set out some requirements because that's good for competition and for companies. Here, a recommendation for this issue. We don't really have many recommendations, but it is important to disseminate best practices. This is what we suggest. This is for other countries to take those as reference. And the fourth step is to assess proposals. And the main issue here, in terms of competition, is that all proposals should be assessed equally to avoid corruption. This is, we need to strike a balance in order to have an assessment with neutrality. We shouldn't use rules that will favor one party or another party. And there should be a possibility for appeals to have a free-flowing process. Literature also tells us or tries to tell us what the magical formula is, but there's none for the proper weighing of these variables to make decisions. The price or the cost for the administration should be a basic variable, but they shouldn't be the only one, because there are other social parameters that need to be considered. We would also recommend to make a sensitivity analysis in the formula to be used. The adjudication formula is simple. We need to make a sensitivity analysis. And in the last part of the proposal assessment, this is where we have one of the greatest issues, and this is collusion among bidders. And this is a concern by the agencies. Also, bid rigging. There are two ways to address this. Ex ante, this is in trying to identify whether the circumstances of the contract lead to the presence of collusion, the collusion among the bidders. We need to identify that upfront, and there's another way to identify that. We need to identify behaviors that are not the appropriate ones as well. But in any case, our recommendations for these is to have a clear database of the results of the bid or the tender. And also to forbid hiring in the public sector, those that have had a bad reputation. And the last point is contract management. And there's also a competition issue here in terms of the design of the project. Sometimes are long-lasting contracts. Here, it all depends on the type of infrastructure project, of course. There are also some mechanisms in which the term is extended or is shorter. And also there are important topics that we have detected. Renegotiations, not all renegotiations are the same. Some are good, some are not. This is something we need to pay attention to. And so what we did was to try to analyze the situation in Latin America. What we did in our project was to have a global vision of the issues based on the literature and then to see what the situation is in Latin America. And what we've seen is that there is a huge heterogeneity among the countries. There are countries that are far ahead in institutional management. Some of them have very clear mechanisms to fight the issues regarding lack of competition. However, there are other countries in which they're just starting. They're not really addressing those issues. In our study, what we did was to perform a detailed analysis from all the regulatory agencies that had some capacity in the region to participate in the designs of PPP and the regulatory management of competition issues to try to see what their features were. And what we found was that practically there were none. That is good because that gives us the opportunity to learn from each other and also to develop a system of information exchange or information sharing. This is a type of agencies, what they do, and as you can see, there's a huge heterogeneity. We need also to analyze some practical cases. We've seen the case of Chile, the case of Colombia, the case of Peru. With these countries we have had experience with, and we've seen that there is a clear awareness of the issue. They know that without competition, without good development of competition rules, PPPs could not thrive as well. So we need to create an infrastructure that is away from monopolies, because if we don't have competition, this won't succeed. In countries like Chile, Colombia, Peru, and others, they do have agencies that set up standards to try to address this lack of competition. I don't want to dwell much on this because I have limited time, and I wish just to thank you. And this is the agenda of the future. There's a long way to go. We're just starting. This is a topic in which sharing information will perhaps lead to better results. And just to answer the questions, well, we have a Q&A to open up the debate. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Javier. Excelente presentación.
Well, thank you, Javier. And this was a great presentation. And thank you very much for remaining within the time allotted to you. So we will now talk to the other panelists, and after this we will open the session for Q&A. Have Diego Avila, who is an advisor for the PPP schemes for infrastructure projects of the Planning Department of Colombia. Diego is a lawyer with more than 20 years of experience in contracts and regulation, particularly regarding the implementation of PPPs for the development of infrastructure. He has been in charge of coordinating the regulation for PPPs and the ancillary laws. Javier Encinas is the Deputy Director of the International Team of Structured Projects of the IPA in the UK. Javier is a specialist in infrastructure and finance, and with more than 20 years of experience in corporate finance projects and management consultancy. Javier is an advisor to governments and implementing units and PPP policies and in planning and delivery infrastructure projects. He is in charge of international programs of advising and training of the IPA, which is the UK Infrastructure and Project Authority. Mariana San Martin, I am very glad to see you again. And she is a senior manager, a senior infrastructure manager of the Open Contracting Partnership, which is an international organization that aims at breaking silos between the government and the civil society and the private sector to open procurement in the world. Before working with CP, she's been working with open government for more than 10 years, including several regional governments, including Argentina and other organizations like the World Bank. And I am going to open the panel with Diego Avila. Diego, Colombia has a very developed environment regarding PPPs. We were told in the panels and in the presentation that it is very important, first and foremost, analyze the environment to start with PPP contracts, and organizations like yours have been key to drive PPPs and investment. So what have you done from DNP to strengthen transparency in infrastructure development processes? And I will give you a very specific example. In Paraguay, the government implemented a tool from Colombia, which is map investments, which maps not only traditional investments or traditional infrastructure projects, but also PPPs. And this is a tool that helps transparency, but I would like to hear more about that. Well, I would like to start by saying that there are bottlenecks everywhere in projects, and that is one of the key issues. At DNP, we have introduced improvements in the chain of development of infrastructure projects, because overall, quality means transparency, information means transparency, and accountability means transparency. So this is why from the beginning and from the early stages of DNP, we have worked in planning projects And we have worked in developing different planning tools and project management tools. So it is important that from day one, the projects that we work are included within the development plans and within our planning instruments, because that will guarantee transparency. Another thing is that we have worked in structuring the projects and that we need to have projects with good scope. Our evolution in PPPs in Colombia was very interesting. Before we had Law 1508 in 2012, there was a lot of disputes regarding the selection of projects, of technical aspects, or the bidders. And after Law 1508 was issued, now we don't have as many challenges, if any. Then selection processes are much more amiable and less controversial. And this is because we now have better structuring of the processes and the projects, and we have a better selection process as well. Something that has already favored the progress has been that contracts are standard for both PPPs and public and traditional investments. So this has reduced the costs of operational costs, and has also allowed for transparency and to improve competition. Colombia has a scheme that promotes competition, and we have also worked with sectors that allow regulating agencies and also private sector that advocate for a good experience for the user and for competition. And we try to avoid monopolies or any type of restrictive environment. So we can have access to investors and contractors under the best conditions. And this can be seen in the non-solicited bids, because we need to maintain a balance there. We need to incentivize submission of bids. But if in fostering good competition, we have also identified some aspects that are necessary to be taken into account, because we have a law that provides for that. So we need to start having bids that will reflect all this. Thank you very much. So after Colombia, we'll go to the UK. So many times the PPP UK experience is considered the benchmark throughout the world. And while the scheme has been modified and the processes and the projects have been strengthened, what would be the recommendations regarding transparency in the development and preparation of PPP projects to strengthen these initiatives in Latin America and the Caribbean? Well, thank you, Juan, and thank you to the people from the IDB and the PPP network for asking me to be part of this Congress, and I am honored to share this panel with you. Transparency can be promoted at three levels in the context of infrastructure. First, at the project level, with a very strict processes for a specific project. We can also promote transparency at the model level by applying open contracting processes that are less prone to obscurity. And then PPP regulates the relationship between the private sector and the public sector, and they make clear the rights and obligations, the costs, the length of time, the relationship between the parties, early termination, dispute mechanisms, dispute resolution mechanisms. So those are the different levels at which transparency can be promoted at project level and at the model level, but the purpose is to reach system transparency. So that means developing a framework that will encourage the development of transparent practices regardless of the model, irrespective of the type of project. And the first step to reach this system transparency is to reduce discretionality and improve best practices through standardization of processes, guidelines, methodologies, tools, contracts, project documents, etc. In the UK, we first started by standardizing the 5-case models, which provides a specific common framework to both public and private sector for the preparation, evaluation, and auditing of investment proposals. Investment proposals is anything that is funded by the public sector. So this common framework is used for all public investments in the UK, not only for infrastructure. So this would be the backbone of the PPP system in the UK. So we have case studies, we have rules, regulations, and this common framework
poco a poco se fue acompañando con un marco institucional robusto, con puntos de evaluación y aprobación, con herramientas sectoriales suplementarias, etc.
Was also supplemented with a robust legal framework and other ancillary laws. So today we have a system that has allowed us to reduce the cost of transaction and to capture social benefits. And we have also 3 benefits: transparency, which means everyone knows how things are done, who does what with what, and the amount of the resources. Consistency, all sectors, all projects at every level of a government operate within the same model. And continuity. Continuity means that this system has been applied in the past, it is applied right now and in the future, regardless of who is in power. So in short, system transparency can be attained if discretionality is reduced and if best practices are standardized. So for me, that is what is clear. Thank you, Javier. Your description of all 3 levels, a project, model, and system was very interesting. And now let's go, we will shift to transparency throughout the world, and Mariana San Martin is here with us. So Open Contracting Partnership has a broad program to support public institutions in Latin America so that public contracts are open, fair, and efficient. And to this end, it is important to improve transparency and accountability. It is also important to have to be more digitized, to have better data that will overlap with digital transformation. So can you tell us what the Open Contracting Partnership does and what is that you see particularly in the infrastructure sector in Latin America and the Caribbean? Well, thank you all for the implementation, and I will talk to you about the problem.
Enfoques participativos y mediciones de impacto, que es lo que mencionaba Javier Campos. A esto nosotros lo llamamos casos de uso, que es básicamente tener
we need to measure impact, and this is basically means that we need to have effective monitoring and good decision making. So we want data to be open so that they standardized so that they can be interoperable. We need to have project managers, and we need to have contracts that will link to one another and that can be used through different agencies. We need to have visibility on the contracts that are part of the same project so that we can follow up the whole project and monitor delivery and development of the project. We need to be able to measure the challenges ahead, and we can also think of the use of infrastructure to develop or to deliver benefits to the people. Like, for example, if you are going to use as infrastructure for SMEs or to reach vulnerable people. So the different areas of the government and the private sector and civil society must have access to everything so that they can work together. We work with the civil society as well. And additionally, we are based on evidence and on case studies, and this allows us to have measurable and clear goals so that we can know what we need to analyze. We need to understand who are the users are so that we can measure specific things like market opportunities and value for money, etc. We also address issues of gender and inclusion. I have worked with different governments in Argentina and to assess infrastructure projects in the region. In infrastructure, the projects are much more complex, very different from goods and services, because in infrastructure projects involve many contracts, many government agencies. So for an infrastructure project, you can have IT in one ministry, and you can have you can have planning in another. So it is very easy to lose visibility of the whole project. So sometimes there is a difficulty in finding the contracts. Then we have differences in the prices and quality of the materials that have to be taken into consideration when you are developing a project. Then you find relevance, and in infrastructure it's very difficult to have benchmarks and comparison. And in addition to prices and costs, low prices doesn't always mean the best, because many times that implies environmental risks or low quality materials. And while it is said that predeterminations are not always bad, these figures can be changed once that the project is ongoing. And it is sometimes projects are undertaken without knowing clearly what the end goal is, and it also can be the case that when projects are undertaken, it will take very, very long time to be completed. In Latin America and the Caribbean, there are many challenges. According to the IADB, 3 to 8% of the GDP is needed in infrastructure, and it is calculated that only 2% of the GDP was invested in infrastructure projects, and PPPs is a very sensitive sector. Discretionality, corruption is prevalent. There is a constant change in the rules of the game, and the changes with every change of government. There is an inefficient planning, inefficient execution. There is a restriction in access to financial markets, and then there are the social issues and the climate risks. Well, Mariana, Thank you very much. We have another 20 minutes, so I will ask another question. I would like to remind our attendees, which is a little more than 200, that if they have a question, please write it on the Q&A section of a platform. Diego, what are the lessons learned in Colombia that you would like to share with other countries in the region regarding the implementation of competition and transparency standards for PPPs? And my specific question, I know that there are many sides to this, but I would like to ask you something specific. Colombia has a very strong tradition of public investments. I am a witness of everything that you've done regarding processes and procedures. How can other countries get ready for this? How can, if they want to implement efficient and effective PPP schemes? Beyond the critical issue of standardization and documentation that Javier has referred to, I think that the supply of information is fundamental. We have seen that you can make daily improvements for the sake of transparency, but we believe firmly that the foundation to attaining transparency and accountability is the quality of information. In PPP schemes, we have been able to implement a better information reporting scheme, and we are very demanding in information reportings because we need to be able to compare the capacity of the private sector against that of the public sector. And we need to be strong and proactive and knowledgeable from that information. We need to be able to also harness on the experiences of the private sector. We need to have information regarding costs, contingencies, and also regarding the performance of the infrastructure, just to name a few. We need to be able to make the best decisions, not only for the sake of transparency and competition, but for other matters as well. As I have said before, we need to link the planning process to the public investment. We need to have sound development plans, and we need to create a project, a bank, so that we can assess and determine at an early stage what is the scope of a project, what are the needs that need to be met. And we need to also have criteria to prioritize the project. So this is why we need to have a bank of projects. Then we need to make public investment according to the impact that private investment projects could have. So needs for infrastructure are many, but we need to match them with fiscal responsibility as well. Infrastructure projects create an important burden for future budgets. So we need to undertake projects that are adequate for each state's capacity to undertake these commitments. Thank you, Diego. As you said, improving the existing information regarding costs and the development of infrastructure for decision making leads me to the next question that I will ask to Javier. Javier, during your first intervention, you said that supervising the processes is very important to guarantee that there are no monopolistic practices or collusion. So what can you tell us about the UK experience regarding control and supervision of processes for PPPs? The IPA UK has emphasized the creation of supervision programs. We have invested 74 billion pounds in different types of infrastructure, schools, bridges, roads. So we have a PFI model, which is the most renowned PPP model. So many of the projects that were bid 25 years ago are going back to the government. And just to give you an idea, between 2022 and 2027, something around 60 PFI programs and projects will come back to the government of the UK. And the problem is between 2027 and 2037, because we expect 500 projects to go back to the government. If you add the numbers, that means one project per week in the decade between 2027 and 2037. So that means a huge challenge. Every Monday for 10 years, one PFI project will go back to the public hands in the UK. So what are we going to do with those projects? One must remember that many of these PFI projects belong to the municipalities and to the regions, so are not part of the central government. We have a team at IPA UK that supports subnational authorities with training and tools to help them assess their options. Please be reminded that these are not our projects, but are the projects of those authorities, and this is important to bear in mind. We need to help them so that the market gets a very uniform response from them. So when, as the governments come back to the government, and as a PFI projects mature, and as we learn lessons, then we will have many things to learn. But what we have to share right now is that that PPPs are not self-regulation projects. So we thought that if we got the private sector involved, they would self-regulate, but that is not true. The public sector has to be active in the control and oversight of the projects. We have a project called Crossrail that crosses London from end to end. And the chairman of that project said that the best project with the best bidding process can become the worst nightmare of a public sector if they do not, if they are not properly managed. So you have to have a standardized contract with robust clauses that will protect the interests of the public sector and the private sector. We need to ensure that the contract is used constantly and that it is used in project management. So we don't need to have things lying on the shelf and not being used. And we need to also professionalize public contract managers. We need to give them certifications. We need to give them career opportunities. So we want the public sector contract managers to go to other projects, to mega projects or to public work projects, but we need to maintain their capacity. So we need to have good contracts, user contracts, and professionalized contract managers.
Con una frase que me va a llevar a la siguiente pregunta y voy a tomar parte de la siguiente pregunta y voy a tomar parte de
Thank you, Javier.
de Q&A.
I'm going to look at the questions that we have in the Q&A box, and you mentioned that they are not self-regulated, that the public sector plays a key role. And I would like to add something. Perhaps there's also a role that the civil society plays, communities,
que nos
So
dice,
I have a
respecto a la
question by Oscar
participación y
Larenas
seguimiento, ¿qué
from
rol
the
le cabe
audience
a la comunidad o a las
regarding
comunidades
follow-up
en dar
and
seguimiento y
participation. What
controlar
is the
estos
role of
proyectos? Entonces me
communities
paso
in order
directamente a
to provide
Mariana, que
follow-up
creo que estás
to these
en mejor
projects, to control
posición
those projects? I would
ayudarnos
like
con
to
esta
ask
consulta
Mariana.
de
Mariana
Oscar Larenas.
is really gonna help us
Sí, totalmente.
with Oscar Larenas'
El
question.
rol de otros
Yes,
actores es fundamental para pedir esa
the
información,
role
para pedir
of
esos
other
datos al gobierno y
stakeholders is
después
critical
poder analizar
to
qué es lo que está
monitor
sucediendo y poder monitorear con
and to ask
evidencia.
for data to
Para
see what's
esto
going on
menciono
and
un par
also
de
to
ejemplos en los que
monitor
venimos trabajando.
evidence-based.
Por
I
ejemplo,
have a couple of
Nuevo León, en
examples that we've
México,
been
se
working on.
creó
For
una
example, in
coalición
Nuevo León,
entre
in
sociedad
Mexico,
civil, sector privado
a
y
coalition
gobierno,
was
en una
created between the
plataforma
civil
que se llama
society,
Infraestructura
private
Abierta,
sector, and the
donde
government.
se pasaron a
This is
publicar
a
todos los proyectos
platform that
de
is called
Secretaría de
Open
Infraestructura
Infrastructure
con datos y
to
visualizaciones
publish
con la
all the
información completa de
projects
todos los
of the
proyectos,
infrastructure
como
department
inclusive
with the entire
compensación, costos,
information of all
contratistas, fuente de
projects,
financiamiento, método de
and
adquisición,
also
a través de
about contractors,
los estándares
financing,
que nosotros usamos, que son el estándar de
according
contrataciones
to
abiertas,
the standards that we
que
use.
llamamos OCDS y OCDS para infraestructura, y con esa riqueza de datos se pudieron llevar
And
adelante
this is
análisis,
according to
por
what
ejemplo,
we
sobre
use, and with
competencia,
this
donde
data,
vimos que en promedio los licitadores
everybody
por
knew
licitación
about
aumentó en
competition.
35%, se
We
vieron
saw
ahorros
that
en
the
costos
average
y
bidders,
muchísimas otras cosas,
the,
por
the
ejemplo, en la
average
ciudad de
number of
Buenos
bidders
Aires,
increased.
donde creamos
We learned many things, or in
una
Buenos Aires, for
plataforma
example,
llamada
where
Vea
we
Obras,
developed
donde estaban todos
a
los proyectos de infraestructura con
platform
información clave. Y
where
esto, por
all the
ejemplo, lo tomó
infrastructure
una
projects
organización de
were
sociedad
with their
civil
key
llamada
information.
SIC,
And so
para
this
hacer el
was
análisis
taken by a civil
específicamente en
society
el proyecto de
organization
urbanización que
called
se había
TIC
hecho en la Villa
to make a
31,
specific analysis of
como
the
parte de este plan
urbanization
general ambicioso que hubo en
project that had
2016.
taken
Entonces
place
acá buscaron
in Region
entender si las obras que
31.
se habían hecho en el lugar fueron efectivas para sus
And so
beneficiarios y
that
analizaron
was
datos de
for
plataforma,
them to know whether
examinaron
those
los costos de
those
infraestructura y
works had been
apelaron a la
beneficial.
participación
They
ciudadana
examined
de
that.
los
They
vecinos del
also look
barrio
at the
para ver el impacto
infrastructure, and
real
they
que estas
appeal
obras
to the
habían tenido en el
citizens'
barrio.
participation
Y acá
of the
pudieron
neighbors
ver,
to see
con la
the
evidencia
impact
de
that
estos
those works
datos,
had. And they
que
were able to
los
see with
vecinos, por
evidence
ejemplo,
that
no
neighbors, for example,
no veían que estas obras se habían
neighbors
materializado en agua
hadn't
potable, electricidad u otros
seen
servicios
benefits in
que
those
hubieran
works because
mejorado.
there was no
Entonces
electricity,
fue
no
vital poder
running
cruzar
water,
los datos
those
de lo que se
services did
había
not
hecho
improve.
con lo
So
que
it was
estaban
critical to be
viviendo los
able
vecinos
to
del
cross
barrio,
the
o
data of
incluso
what had been
ciertos
done
proyectos que lo que
versus the
mencionaba antes,
benefits.
que por ahí el
And
objetivo
also
no
some
era lo que
projects,
necesitaban los
and
beneficiarios
as I said before, that perhaps the
realmente.
project,
En Chile
the
también
purpose of the project was
empezamos
not
por
to
una
benefit
coalición
users. Like
multiactor
in
con un
Chile,
compromiso
also,
entre el
we
Ministerio de
started
Infraestructura de
developing
Chile, la Cámara
a
Chilena de
coalition
Construcción y
with the
de sociedad civil a
infrastructure
través de una organización que se llama
Ministry of
Observatorio del Gasto
Chile
Fiscal,
and also the
donde
civil
consensuaron
society.
que se iba a armar una
So
plataforma
we created
donde se
this
iban a publicar
coalition
determinados datos de
to put
infraestructura
together a
y con
platform
eso se iban a
to
llevar adelante
publish
visualizaciones y
the
análisis de
infrastructure
datos,
projects
pero también
in
fue
order to make the
impulsado
data
por esta coalición.
analysis and
La
supervision.
plataforma
All
está
of this
llevada
was
adelante
driven by
por la
this
sociedad
coalition.
civil,
The
pero
platform
a través de estos actores.
was
Y un
made
último
was put
ejemplo que
together by the
menciono que me
civil
parece
society with
muy
the
lindo porque
participation of
surgió
several
de sociedad
stakeholders.
civil,
And
que
one
fue con
last point,
infraestructura
which is
escolar en
very good
Paraguay,
because it came from the civil
donde
society, was
hubo
with the
una
school
cuestión con el
infrastructure in
Ministerio
Paraguay,
de Educación y
because
fondos que no
there
se
was
estaban
an
usando
issue
correctamente
with the
para lo que se tenían que
education
usar, por lo
ministry
que una
funds
organización
that had been
llamada de
misused.
Acción
And
empezó a
so
analizar
a
las obras de
civil
infraestructura
organization
adjudicadas
called Acción
para
started to
beneficio de
analyze
ciudad de la
the
y ahí vieron
infrastructure
que de los
works
28 contratos que se habían
in the
adjudicado para
schooling
infraestructura
area, and
escolar,
they found
solo
that the
uno
28
era
contracts that
para
had been
las 5
allocated
escuelas
for
con
school
mayor necesidad
infrastructure,
de
only one
infraestructura y
was
3 ni
for
siquiera
the
estaban en
most
ese
needy
municipio. Entonces
schools,
con eso
and
crearon una
3 were not
metodología que
even
puede ser
in that
replicada por otros grupos
municipality.
de
So
ciudadanos,
with that,
donde
they
minutos
developed a
voluntarios a escuelas,
methodology that later was
entrevistan a
replicated by
directores y se
other
toman fotos, mientras
citizens.
que un segundo grupo
And so they
analiza los datos
interviewed
abiertos
the
de los
school
portales.
principals,
Y
they
esto
took
lo que hizo fue
pictures,
que
and
empiecen a
they
trabajar
also
junto con el
analyzed
gobierno
the open
para
data. And
tener
so
un
all
nuevo
of
módulo
this
de
led
carga para poder
for
hacer
the
el
government
monitoreo
and the
del
civil
programa
society to
primero.
work together in order to
Muchas gracias,
monitor the
Mariana.
different
Nos quedan
infrastructure
5
projects.
minutos, 7
Thank you,
minutos
Mariana.
máximo.
We
Voy a
have
tomar
5,
2
7
preguntas muy
minutes
rápidas
left,
y les pido a los
and I would
panelistas
like to
que
take
también no
2
sean
very quick
ágiles en las
questions, and I would
respuestas,
like
pero
to
me
ask the
parece
panel
sumamente
participants to give a brief answer. These two are very interesting questions that we have from our participants.
nos escribe en portugués y
Flavio
nos pone sobre
Ferreira
la mesa un tema
Pesel,
interesante,
he
que es el
asks
tema de los
in Portuguese, and
monopolios
he
naturales.
is
Y nos pregunta
asking
cómo se puede
about
generar
natural
la
monopolies,
competencia,
and he's asking
cómo se
how
puede
can you
asegurar competencia
create
en algunos que parecen
competition,
ser, por
how
ejemplo,
can
en
you ensure
saneamiento,
competition
dice
in
Flavio,
some,
algunos
like in
monopolios naturales.
sanitation, for example,
Y Fulton
because
de
sometimes there are
Aldén y
natural
Zambrano nos
monopolies, how
escribe
to
sobre los
introduce
proyectos
competition. And
municipales
Fulton,
y nos
Denis
pregunta
Zambrano
cómo
writes
hacer
about
para
municipal projects.
evitar
How
el
can we
interés de
make
inversión pública,
to
considerando, por
avoid
ejemplo, casos de
the
corrupción en los
interest
niveles
of the public
subnacionales. Entonces, el
investment
primer punto
concerning
se lo voy a
corruption,
pasar a
for
Javier,
example,
que
how
tiene
to
que ver
avoid
con
that.
el
So
tema
the
de los
first
monopolios. ¿Qué nos
point
puedes
will be
contar en temas de
for
inversión
Javier.
privada?
This has to do with monopolies.
Y
What
el
can you
segundo
tell
punto se
us
lo
in terms
paso
of
a
private
Diego y con esto
investment?
cerramos, si les
And the
parece.
second point is for
Javier,
Diego.
adelante.
And here we will be
Bueno,
closing
muy
this
rápido.
panel.
Sí, completamente
Go
concuerdo
ahead.
con lo que se dice.
Yes, I fully agree
En este país,
with
todas las
what
redes de agua, luz y
it is said.
electricidad han sido
In
privatizadas
this country,
durante los
all
años de
the
la era Thatcher.
electricity waters,
Lo
the
que
electricity
se hizo durante
grid,
esa
the power,
privatización es
the
dar
water,
efectivamente un
all of that
monopolio
was
a compañías
privatized.
que cubren
In the
toda una región,
privatization of utilities,
compañías
a
de agua,
monopoly
técnicos de
was given
electricidad. Entonces
to
tiene
some
un
companies that
monopolio
run
institucionalizado, si quieres.
running water
Y
or
para eso existe un
electricity,
regulador
so
muy
they
fuerte.
have an
Y ese regulador cada
institutionalized
5
monopoly, so
años
to speak. And for that, we have a regulator, and the
revisa
regulator
el
every
marco
5
que tiene
years
que ver con los costos, con los beneficios,
goes
con la
over
calidad de la
the
infraestructura y la calidad de los servicios
costs,
dados. Entonces eso es
benefits,
importante en un
the
regulador
quality of the
fuerte que tenga los dientes y la
infrastructure, and the
capacidad
rendering of services. So
para
it's
evitar
important to have a regulator that has the
el regulador
capacity
en
to
una opción
prevent
monopolística abuse de su posición. Pero eso también se
the
puede dar
monopoly
en una
companies
obra
will
pública o
abuse
en un
their
PPP.
position.
Hay
But
ciertos
that also
sectores, por ejemplo,
can take
telecomunicaciones,
place in
defensa,
a
en ocasiones
PPP in
material
certain
rodante, en los
sectors, like
proyectos
in the
de
telecommunication
férreos de alta
sectors or
velocidad,
defense,
donde hay muy pocos
or for
jugadores. Si pensamos
example, in
en
the
alta velocidad, existe Alstom, existe
fast train
Siemens
projects.
y
We have there Alstom, for
Bombardier.
example, or
Si se te caen
Siemens,
dos de esos tres,
or
te
we
quedas
also
una vez
have
más con una
Bombardier.
situación
So
monopolista.
if
Si eso es lo que
two
sucede,
of them
aquí lo que pasa es que
are
se
left
permite
aside,
hacer algo que
you
se
will
llama
end up with
open
monopoly. And if
accounting.
that happens,
Entonces,
we
el
allow for
oferente con
an
esa
open
posición
accounting.
monopolística te tiene que
So
abrir
that
números
means that
y te tiene que mostrar cuáles son sus costos, cuáles son los
that
costos
that
que le
that
está
they that
cargando
the
al sector
that the
público
operator
para
needs to
asegurarnos que
open
no
up
nos está
the books. They need to disclose their
que no está
costs
abusando
to make sure
de esa
that
posición. Entonces, hay formas
this
de
one
controlar
single player is not abusing
estas situaciones
citizens. So there are
oligopolísticas
ways to
o
control
incluso
these
monopolísticas cuando
situations,
se dan en el
which
mercado.
are oligopolies or monopolies
Muchas
whenever they
gracias,
occur in the
Javier.
market. Yeah, there are ways
Diego,
to
sobre el
control
tema
them.
municipal, ¿qué nos puedes
Thank you,
contar en 2
Javier.
minutos?
Diego, talking about
Creo que es
the municipal
importante
issue, what can you
iniciar
tell us
actividades desde
about
el
that?
sector
It is
central cuando
important
existe
to
esta
start
descentralización territorial,
activities
programas de capacitación, de
when
formación
there is a
institucional, de
decentralization. We need
profesionalización
to
en las
provide training
actividades.
programs
Es difícil y
and
en esa
institutional
medida desde el
strengthening
sector central
programs.
es necesario
It is
prestar asistencia
difficult.
técnica,
It
proveer
is key to
información,
provide technical
guías,
assistance.
documentos de
It is
apoyo,
important to provide
inclusive personal
information,
capacitado que pueda
supporting
coadyuvar en la
documents,
administración
and
con
even we
base
need
a
to
toma de
have
decisiones.
trained
Es
staff
importantísimo los
to
programas
really
de
help in the
capacitación, es
management or the
importantísimo los programas
administration of the
de asistencia
municipality.
técnica.
Training
También
programs are very
concientizar a las
important.
entidades
It is important
territoriales,
to
a los
provide technical
municipios, sobre
assistance
todo en
and also
proyectos de
to
gran
raise
envergadura, en
awareness
la asignación de
of
equipos
the
de trabajo
municipalities, especially in major
dedicados
projects,
exclusivamente a
that they
los
need to
proyectos con
create
una dedicación muy
work
importante a los
teams that will be
proyectos, que apropien
dedicated
estos proyectos,
to
que lo
those
conozcan,
projects.
que se encarguen de
This
gestionarlos
is
a lo
for them
largo de
to
toda
make
la
those
vida del
projects
proyecto,
their
toda la
own,
vida del
and
proyecto,
to
porque
run those
desafortunadamente a nivel
projects
territorial
along the
las
life of
decisiones
the
pueden ser
project, because
temporales, de corto
unfortunately,
plazo, y el
sometimes
conocimiento se
decisions
pierde.
are
Es muy
temporary or
importante trabajar
short-term
en esos equipos de
decisions, and
trabajo
then the
y en la
knowledge gets
asistencia técnica.
lost. It is important to work with those work
Excelente,
teams
Diego.
and to provide technical assistance.
Exactamente 10:10, vamos a
Great,
dar
Diego.
cierre a este panel. Yo
Yeah, it's
quisiera
exactly
simplemente decir
10:10. We will be closing
unas
this
breves
panel,
palabras
and I would
agradeciendo a
simply like
nuestros
to
expositores, a
add some
Diego, a
additional words.
Javier,
I
a
would like to thank
Mariana
our
y por supuesto
speakers,
también a
Diego,
Javier
Javier,
Campos,
Mariana,
que hizo
and
la
of course,
presentación inicial.
Javier
Ha sido un
Campos,
lujo escucharlos.
because he made the
Recordarles
initial
que
presentation. It's
está el
been great
sitio
listening to you.
web
Just to remind
de
you
la
that
red
we
de
have
APPs
the
donde pueden
website
bajar información.
of the
Hay algunas
APP
preguntas que
network where you
todavía no
can
las
download
pudimos abordar, pero
information.
seguramente ahí
There are some
encontrarán
additional questions that
información muy
were
útil para
unanswered.
poder
I'm sure that on the website you can find information to keep learning. I will close by giving the floor to Ancor Suarez. He's the coordinator of the APP network. Special thanks to those that are listening to us, more than 250 listeners on our channel. And now, Ancor, I will give you the microphone to you. Thank you.